So as requested by you guys, I have started a new channel, the Scale Modeling Channel 3D. This channel will be focusing on 3D printer reviews specifically, and the main channel, my main focus, the Scale Modeling Channel, will stay focused on scale model car building and some other stuff occasionally. On the main channel, I will still be focusing on some specific scale modeling related 3D printing reviews, of course, and those will still be posted here. The more technical and in detail reviews about the printers themselves will be on the Scale Modeling Channel 3D. I will be leaving a link to that channel down below. There are no videos there yet, but there are videos in the making and coming there pretty soon. So if you want to stay updated, please subscribe to my new channel. I was recently contacted by Sunlu about their new S9 Plus. This is a pretty big FDM printer, meaning a wire plastic printer, not resin. And they asked me to do a review on it and also show you guys what it is capable of, and in my style just do a couple of things that I thought were useful for the scale modeler. So the printer comes in a pretty big box, mostly assembled already, requires a very little amount of assembly. Simply following the instructions, this took about 10 to 15 minutes before it was fully set up and ready to go. With the S9, you also get a filament dryer. Now normally this would be sold as a separate unit, but in this case it is sort of included with the printer and also connected to the printer. The display and the operation also goes through the actual screen on the printer itself. It shows the current temperature, the humidity, and you can change, of course, the temperature itself you want it to set it to, and the time that it needs to run on that exact screen. If you don't want to use the actual dryer itself, simply disconnect the wire and use the spool holder on the printer itself. Before you can actually start printing, it is of course advised to actually install some of the PLA or ABS or your preferred filament. I simply just like PLA for the ease of use. You can use it in the actual filament dryer or on the spool holder itself. Install it using the settings on the actual machine. Simply just go through the menu, load up the filament, it will start heating it up, and you're pretty much set to go filament wise. Then on the actual bed, it is already pretty well installed from the factory, but it could use a little bit of adjustment, some tightening up here and there just to make sure nothing wiggles around or is loose. Same with all of the rails, the actual extruder from left to right. Make sure everything is nice, tight, and also level. And in this case also tighten up very well on these sort of stabilizer bars, and make sure that they are installed correctly so that it doesn't pull the machine out of alignment. And then finally, before the printing itself can start, make sure that the bed is leveled. On the S9 it is pretty simple, as it comes with a touch probe that automatically levels the bed. Now in this menu for the leveling, you can see all the different points that it measures during the automatic bed leveling. It has different numbers on every one of them, as there is a small difference in height on all of those points, and that is pretty much inevitable as none of these build plates are actually super flat. So if you press the platform measurement, it will sort of start auto leveling, go to all of these points, set them to 0, and then measure the current setting it is in. It saves it in the machine and saves it for the printing itself, so it knows which point is where and can level out the print as best as possible. Now there is also the option to go for the auxiliary leveling, and that pretty much is done to do it yourself instead of using the automated leveling system. So it is basically, very simply put, a manual leveling. It will go to 5 points on the bed itself. You can choose which ones you want to go to. Simply twist the knobs underneath to raise or lower the bed until you're fully satisfied, and go over this a couple of times until it is completely level. Then just put the tools in the small cubby in the printer on the side, and you're set to go. The SD card that comes with the printer has 2 test files on it, and you can simply just print those out and start the initial testing to see if everything is correct and functioning as it should. And during this testing you can also figure out a couple of settings, change them here and there just to see what works best for your printer and your situation. On the screen itself, when you have selected your file, you can still change a couple of settings before you actually start the print up. One of those is to have the auto leveling on or off. If you have it on, it will go through the entire routine of leveling the bed every single time. This takes about 6 to 7 minutes for it to fully complete from start to finish. If you have leveled the bed manually, or you are already happy with the way that it has leveled, you do not need to turn this on. However, if you want to be absolutely certain that the level is done properly, you can turn it on and start the print. So in this case, for the example, I have set the auto leveling system on, and it will go through the entire bed all the way front to back, going over all of those points, measuring them one by one until it has finished at the end, and will then move on to the center position, or at least in this case the starting position of the actual print, and will start printing. Now this is the test file. I had absolutely no idea what it was, so I was kind of curious to see what it was without plugging it into the computer and looking at the file beforehand, just trying to figure out what the machine is going to test and how useless of a part it will actually be, as most of the time it is just a small fun object that has pretty much no use whatsoever. So I let it sit for about an hour, hour and a half, and then could move on to just simply stopping the print, as I noticed that the printer was working perfectly well. It was leveled out super nice, and this is a part that I have no use for, but it simply does show that the printer is working as it should be. So it turned out to be a small clover leaf vase or vase, or just a thing to put some pens in, and it simply looked fun, but again, it had no use, and I wanted to print some actual useful parts. Now, just to make it very clear, I absolutely suck at 3D designing. I use Tinkercad. That is a website from AutoCAD with very basic skills required to model some parts. What I wanted to do was organize a couple of drawers with some specific tools and have them laid out nicely in those drawers, and not move around, and have them be well organized. So I spent some time laying out all of the tools and pieces that I wanted in there, and then designed it in Tinkercad, then exported it to an STL file, opened it in Cura, set some of the slicing settings that it required for the printer, sent it over to the printer, and actually started printing it. After about 16 hours, the printer is completed, or almost 17 hours, and the screen goes to a sort of sleep mode until you activate it again, and it just keeps falling asleep just to save on power. Then remove the magnetic build plate holder, or the build plate itself actually, and start test fitting some of these parts to see if this was actually the final design, or that it needed some more customization, maybe sizing up or down in some of the cases until all of the parts fit in here perfectly. So this was actually the second try. I tried it beforehand. Some of the slots were a bit too small, others were a bit too big, so I just resized a couple of them until the parts or tools fit in there as I wanted them to, and could then finally print this version that you see here, which perfectly fits into the hobby zone drawers that I have all over my desk. With the first project completed, I could move on to the next one. On my desk, I've had a simple design that holds a couple of glue bottles and some accelerator, and also the decal setting and softening solutions that I use all of the time. Now, it wasn't really up to snuff anymore. I wanted to have something different, so I designed some new ones. In this case, specifically for the glue, and also a separate one for the decal setting, softening, decal tweezers, and also some of the brushes that I use for those parts specifically, so that I have it in a separated organizer. So after some more super complicated, and complicated is done with air quotes, design work and print work, these are completed as well. Now, of course, this was not the first try, and I did go through a couple of iterations here and there before everything fit the way I wanted it to, but in the end, I'm really happy with the way that it came out. All the glue bottles are in there nice and sturdy, don't really fall over that easily, and the same goes for the decal setting softening solution. It is high enough so that it doesn't tip over easily, and all of the brushes and tweezers in this case fit in there nicely the way that I want them to, and are really easily accessible. Now there are some sort of ghosting marks on the back here that you can see. That simply has to do with the sidewall not really being thick enough, and the supports and also the other shapes coming through a little bit. So that is simply down to the settings on the actual slicer and not the fault of the printer. Just like the small ones, the big one is also completed. As you could see previously, all of the tools that I want in there are now nicely organized. The ones here on the lower right corner could use a little bit of an adjustment and a reprint, but that would take another 17 hours, and I think it is good enough at this point, as my design work is pretty well sorted for this one, and just upgrading it for those smaller pieces which lay in there pretty nicely isn't really worth it for an entire reprint again. Now, thinking of a reprint, I could also design in a couple of the actual numbers so that I know which drill bit needs to go where, but in this case on the drill bits itself it also has the number already on there, so it's not really worth it. But then again, maybe it is, but that is down to you guys, or me in this case. I don't really want to do another print, but if you guys do want to see that, feel free to let me know down in the comments. The final print that I did was for a sort of holder for the instruction manuals. Now it actually is one to hold up your tablet, your iPad, or your Samsung tablet, whatever you want. But I figured it could be used really well just to hold up the instruction manual and not have it laid down, take up a lot less space, and simply just help out a little bit on the desk itself. As mentioned earlier in the video, all of the parts that have been printed here have gone through a trial and error phase. Some of them have been printed out a couple of times. I figured I'd had the final design set. All of the parts fit in there really well, but then again, it wasn't really as sturdy as it was simply a bit too low, so I simply just heightened it up or made it a little bit higher so that the parts fit in there a bit better and weren't as wonky all over. Now for the main part that I was pretty proud of, this decal sort of solution, I printed it out, thought I'd figured it out, but then in the end the actual tweezers themselves didn't fit in, and the brushes were way too loose, so it was wiggling around all over the place. So these are just simply a couple of these smaller pieces that I had designed just to test fit some of the parts before I finished up the final design, as I went through it, of course. And also not to forget the first actual print that came off of it. This was just simply printed with the standard white PLA that came with the printer. Came out really smooth, no imperfections to show whatsoever. The layer lines are really fine, stacked up super smooth, and has a great finish. Now the major one you can see here was the first initial print. A lot of these components were just a little bit too tight for the actual tool to fit in there, or in some cases they were just perfectly fitting. But simply one fitting and the other doesn't, that doesn't complete a part, so I redesigned a couple of them until I finalized this one. So the final verdict on the printer, I'm really happy with the way that the parts come out. It prints relatively fast, is pretty silent, and has a relatively smooth finish. Now the finish can be improved on a lot of these parts with a bit more setup on the actual slicer and also adjustment on the printer itself. But overall, for just taking it out of the box, it is simply really well put together and works really easily without too much knowledge on 3D printing. Now, of course, some of these parts or tools for on my Workbench are personally designed by me, and I can print more of them. If you guys would be interested in having these in the Scale Modeling channel webshop, let me know down in the comments below, or simply send me an email and we can figure something out there. If you're interested in purchasing this printer, I will be leaving links in the description down below to Sunlu's website. You can find a lot more info about the printer and many of their other products on there.